Some promises are so powerful that they can make a person refuse freedom itself. On the morning the gates of the sprawling Hayes estate opened to release every longtime employee with generous severance packages, no one expected a single person to remain behind. Luxury sedans lined the circular driveway, moving trucks rolled through the front entrance, and grateful workers hugged one another before beginning new chapters of their lives. The mansion, once filled with constant footsteps and quiet conversations, slowly emptied beneath a bright autumn sky. At the center of it all stood the Black Maid, Grace Carter, holding a small canvas travel bag that contained everything she owned. The staff assumed she would be the next to leave. Instead, she calmly placed the bag back on the polished marble floor and folded her hands in front of her apron. Across the entrance hall, Victor Hayes, the respected owner of the estate, watched the unusual scene with measured curiosity. He had personally approved generous compensation for every employee after reorganizing his household, believing it was the most honorable way to thank those who had served for years. One by one, each person accepted the offer with gratitude. Only Grace quietly shook her head. The room fell silent as dozens of eyes turned toward her. One of the departing housekeepers whispered that perhaps Grace hoped for more money. Another guessed she had nowhere else to go. A groundskeeper suggested she simply feared change after spending so many years inside the mansion. Grace answered none of them. Her expression remained peaceful, neither embarrassed nor defensive. Victor stepped closer, maintaining the calm confidence that had earned the respect of everyone who worked for him. He reminded her that she was free to begin a new life wherever she wished and assured her that every expense had already been arranged. Grace looked up, meeting his eyes with quiet sincerity before speaking words that immediately unsettled everyone listening. "Thank you, sir, but I still have one job left." The sentence lingered in the vast entrance hall long after her voice faded. Victor frowned slightly. He had reviewed every department, every responsibility, every unfinished project within the estate. There should have been nothing left for anyone to complete. Yet Grace spoke with absolute certainty, as though the matter had already been decided years before. Before anyone could ask another question, she politely excused herself, lifted her worn canvas bag, and carried it back toward the servants' corridor instead of the front door. Several employees exchanged puzzled glances while others quietly laughed, convinced she was creating unnecessary drama. Victor did not laugh. Something about the steadiness in her voice refused to leave his thoughts. Throughout the afternoon, while movers loaded furniture and accountants finalized paperwork, Grace returned to her ordinary routine as if nothing unusual had happened. She dusted antique bookshelves, replaced fresh flowers in crystal vases, straightened family portraits, and greeted every departing employee with the same warm smile she had always worn. There was no urgency in her movements and no sign that she regretted refusing the opportunity everyone else had accepted. As evening settled over the estate and the last moving truck disappeared beyond the iron gates, Victor stood alone near the grand staircase, looking across a mansion that suddenly felt larger and strangely quieter than ever before. Somewhere down a distant hallway, he heard the soft rhythm of Grace's footsteps continuing with patient purpose. And for the first time that day, he found himself wondering whether the greatest mystery inside his mansion was not hidden behind a locked door, but walking its hallways in plain sight. The following evening settled over the Hayes estate with an unusual stillness that seemed to stretch across every hallway and staircase. Most of the guest rooms were dark now that the longtime employees had departed, leaving only a handful of lights glowing behind tall windows that overlooked the gardens. Victor Hayes finished reviewing documents in his study long after sunset, yet his attention repeatedly drifted away from the pages before him. Grace Carter's quiet declaration from the previous morning continued to echo in his thoughts. She had not asked for higher wages. She had not requested a favor. She had simply insisted that one responsibility still remained. The statement made little sense, yet nothing about her expression suggested dishonesty. Throughout the years she had worked inside the mansion, Grace had never exaggerated a story or created unnecessary attention for herself. Her reputation had always rested upon reliability, patience, and remarkable consistency. That alone made her refusal impossible to dismiss. As the grandfather clock in the main hall chimed 10 times, Victor stepped onto the second-floor balcony overlooking the entrance hall. The mansion felt almost unfamiliar without the ordinary sounds of dozens of employees finishing their evening routines. He expected complete silence, but instead he noticed a single light moving slowly through the eastern corridor. It belonged to Grace. Carrying a modest tray with a covered bowl, a folded blanket, a small pitcher of water, and what appeared to be a bottle of medicine, she walked carefully through the corridor without looking in any direction except straight ahead. Her pace was unhurried, almost ceremonial, as though she had completed the same journey countless times before. Victor watched from the shadows without announcing his presence. Grace reached the end of the hallway, disappeared briefly behind an old service entrance that had not been used for years, then quietly closed the door behind her. Nearly 40 minutes passed before she emerged carrying the now empty tray. She carefully straightened the blanket, adjusted the dishes, and returned toward the kitchen as though nothing unusual had happened. The next evening, the exact same pattern repeated. At precisely the same hour, she gathered fresh food, clean linens, and medicine before making the identical walk down the eastern corridor. On the third night, Victor deliberately remained awake to see whether the routine would change. It did not. Every movement appeared planned, calm, and purposeful. By the fourth evening, whispers began circulating among the few remaining employees. One maintenance supervisor quietly wondered whether Grace had secretly claimed one of the abandoned rooms for herself. A kitchen assistant suggested she might be storing valuables before leaving. Another employee speculated that she had become overly attached to the mansion and simply could not accept that her years there had ended. Grace never responded to any of the rumors. She greeted everyone with the same gentle smile each morning, completed every assignment with careful attention, and politely excused herself each evening at nearly the same time. Her peaceful silence only deepened the mystery. Victor found himself observing details he had overlooked for years. Grace always prepared enough food for more than one person, yet she always returned with empty dishes. The folded blanket never looked untouched when she carried it back. The medicine bottle gradually became lighter with each passing day. None of it matched the behavior of someone clinging to a familiar workplace. Instead, it suggested a quiet obligation that had existed long before the mansion began to empty. Standing alone beside one of the tall windows overlooking the moonlit courtyard, Victor realized that the answer he sought would not be found in financial records, household schedules, or conversations with employees. Whatever kept Grace inside the estate after everyone else had departed was hidden somewhere beyond that forgotten hallway. And for the first time since she had entered his service many years before, he decided that he would quietly follow her himself. By the fifth evening, Victor had abandoned the idea that coincidence explained Grace's mysterious routine. Every movement followed the same quiet rhythm, precise enough to resemble a promise rather than a habit. Shortly before 10 o'clock, she entered the kitchen, prepared a simple meal of warm soup, fresh bread, sliced fruit, and hot tea, then carefully added the small bottle of medicine she had carried every night. She checked each item twice before placing everything onto the tray with remarkable care, almost as though she feared disturbing someone who depended entirely upon her arrival. The mansion itself seemed to hold its breath as she disappeared into the eastern corridor once again. This time, Victor remained several steps behind, careful to stay beyond the reach of the soft light cast by antique wall sconces. The farther Grace walked, the older the mansion appeared. Framed photographs from decades earlier lined the walls, their colors faded by time. Furniture that had once occupied the grand rooms had been stored beneath white protective covers. Dust floated gently through narrow beams of moonlight that entered from tall windows overlooking neglected gardens. Very few people visited this forgotten wing anymore. Most newer employees probably did not even know it existed. Grace finally stopped before a heavy wooden door tucked behind an old staircase. The brass handle had lost much of its shine, and the nearby wallpaper showed signs of age that no renovation had ever reached. She reached into the pocket of her apron and removed a small silver key. Victor immediately recognized it. Years earlier, the estate locksmith had mentioned that only one original key remained for that section of the mansion. Victor had never asked who possessed it because he believed those in used rooms held nothing of importance. Grace quietly unlocked the door, slipped inside with the tray, and gently closed it behind her. Victor approached after several moments and stood silently outside. He expected conversation, perhaps even laughter, but the only sounds that reached the hallway were faint words spoken with extraordinary kindness, the soft clink of dishes being arranged on a table, and the comforting tone someone might use while caring for a beloved family member. There was no sign of fear or secrecy. Whatever existed beyond that door was neither criminal nor selfish. It carried the unmistakable feeling of compassion. Victor remained where he was, wrestling with a growing conflict inside himself. Part of him believed he should immediately open the door and demand an explanation. Another part reminded him that Grace had earned his trust through years of unwavering honesty. If she had chosen silence, perhaps she believed she was protecting someone rather than deceiving him. Nearly an hour passed before the door opened again. Grace stepped into the hallway carrying the empty tray and carefully locked the room behind her. She paused briefly, placing one gentle hand against the weathered wood as though silently reassuring whoever remained inside. Then she turned and began walking back toward the main house. Before she could notice him, Victor quietly retreated into the shadows and allowed her to pass. Her face showed neither relief nor anxiety. Instead, it reflected the peaceful satisfaction of someone who had fulfilled an obligation that mattered more than comfort or recognition. Watching her disappear into the brighter halls of the mansion, Victor realized that the rumors whispered among the remaining staff had been entirely wrong. Grace was not refusing to leave because she wanted something from the estate. She was staying because someone hidden within its oldest walls still needed her, and whatever truth waited behind that locked door was powerful enough to outweigh freedom itself. The next night, Victor made a decision that surprised even himself. Instead of remaining hidden outside the forgotten hallway, he waited until Grace unlocked the weathered door and quietly stepped inside before counting to 20. He approached without making a sound, stopping only inches from the entrance. The faint aroma of warm tea drifted into the corridor along with the gentle fragrance of lavender polish that Grace always used while cleaning the mansion. There was no tension in the room beyond the door, only an atmosphere of extraordinary peace. Victor slowly turned the brass handle. The old hinges moved without protest, revealing a small sitting room that time seemed to have forgotten. Heavy curtains softened the moonlight pouring through tall windows, family photographs rested on polished shelves, and a fireplace cast a warm glow across furniture that had clearly been maintained with loving care despite its age. Grace looked up in surprise, though not in fear. She simply lowered the teapot she had been holding and offered the same respectful expression she always carried throughout the estate. Across from her, seated comfortably in a well-worn leather chair beneath a knitted blanket, was an elderly gentleman with silver hair and kind eyes. His face brightened the moment he noticed Victor, standing silently in the doorway. Victor froze. Recognition arrived slowly, carried not by the passing years, but by familiar eyes that had once watched over him with unwavering patience. The elderly man was Samuel Brooks, the former estate manager who had guided the Hayes household through decades of change before quietly disappearing from public life nearly 8 years earlier. Victor had been told that Samuel wished to live privately after declining health forced his retirement. He had never questioned the explanation because business responsibilities had steadily consumed his attention. Samuel smiled warmly. "You finally found us," he said with calm sincerity. Grace remained standing beside him, gently adjusting the blanket over his knees before stepping back, without seeking attention for herself. Victor looked around the room in disbelief. Fresh flowers rested on the windowsill. Medical supplies were neatly organized inside a cabinet. Shelves contained carefully labeled books and family albums free of dust. Every detail reflected years of steady care rather than temporary kindness. Nothing about the room suggested neglect. Instead, it felt like a quiet home hidden inside a mansion that had forgotten one of its own. Victor struggled to understand how such a place could exist beneath his roof without his knowledge. Samuel seemed to recognize the question before it was spoken. He explained that he had preferred privacy after illness made daily responsibilities impossible, and Grace had voluntarily continued visiting every evening. She prepared meals, organized medicine, read newspapers aloud, maintained the room, and never once accepted additional payment. She insisted only that no one disturb his peaceful routine until he was strong enough to choose otherwise. Victor slowly turned toward Grace. She lowered her eyes, not because she felt guilty, but because she had never expected gratitude. To her, this had simply been a promise that required no audience. At last she spoke softly. Years ago, before Samuel stepped away from the estate, he had cared for every employee with quiet fairness, including those whose names many people never remembered. When illness changed his life, Grace quietly promised that as long as she remained in the mansion, he would never spend a single evening believing everyone had forgotten him. That promise, she explained with complete honesty, was the one job she still had left. Victor remained in the quiet sitting room long after Grace finished explaining her promise. The words settled heavily in his thoughts because they revealed something no financial report or household ledger ever could. For years he had believed loyalty could be measured through contracts, responsibilities, and years of service. Grace had quietly demonstrated that true loyalty survived even after every obligation had officially ended. Samuel invited Victor to sit beside the fireplace, and for the first time in many years the owner of the estate listened instead of speaking. The elderly man smiled gently as he described the countless evenings Grace had appeared with fresh meals, carefully organized medicine, clean blankets, and stories from around the estate that made him feel connected to a home he no longer visited. She never complained about the extra hours. She never asked anyone to recognize her efforts. She simply honored the promise she had made on the day Samuel chose to step away from public life. Victor lowered his eyes as memories slowly returned. He remembered how Samuel had once known every employee by name, from gardeners to cooks, and how he had quietly helped struggling families without announcing his generosity. When Victor was younger and still learning to lead the estate, Samuel often reminded him that a house became a home only when every person inside felt valued. Those lessons had gradually faded beneath years of demanding schedules and endless business responsibilities. Grace had preserved them without saying a single word. She finally explained why she had refused the generous severance package. Accepting the money and leaving immediately would have meant breaking the only promise she believed truly belonged to her. She could not walk away knowing that Samuel would wake the following morning expecting her familiar knock at the door and finding only silence instead. Money could begin a new chapter, but it could never replace a promise built through years of quiet trust. Victor understood then that her decision had never been about employment. It had been about character. Looking around the carefully maintained room, he noticed details that had escaped him during his first moments of surprise. Fresh notebooks rested beside Samuel's favorite chair because Grace encouraged him to record family memories. A calendar on the wall contained handwritten reminders for doctor appointments, birthdays, and anniversaries. Framed photographs had been polished so carefully that every smile seemed alive despite the passing years. Even the flowers by the window had been replaced before they could fade. Every corner reflected patience rather than obligation. Victor asked Grace why she had never told him the truth. She answered with calm honesty that Samuel had treasured his privacy and had never wished to become the center of sympathy. She believed protecting his dignity mattered more than receiving praise for helping him. If the day ever came when Victor discovered the truth naturally, then perhaps it was because the promise had reached the moment when it could finally be shared. Silence filled the room once more, but it no longer felt mysterious. It felt meaningful. Victor realized that the greatest failure inside the estate had not been hidden behind an old wooden door. It had been his own assumption that everyone who disappeared from daily life had stopped needing kindness. As he rose to leave, he looked at Grace with new respect. He quietly told her that she had taught him something Samuel had tried to teach years before, but that he had forgotten along the way. Grace simply smiled with gentle humility because, in her heart, she believed she had only done what any grateful person should do when entrusted with a promise that deserved to be kept. The following morning began differently than any other morning the Hayes estate had experienced in years. Instead of retreating immediately to his office after breakfast, Victor quietly walked toward the eastern wing carrying a tray that looked remarkably similar to the one Grace prepared every evening. Fresh coffee, warm oatmeal, sliced peaches, and a folded newspaper rested neatly beside a small vase holding a single white flower from the estate garden. When Grace entered the kitchen to begin her usual routine, she paused in genuine surprise as she watched Victor carefully arranging every item himself. He smiled with quiet humility and admitted that he had spent years believing leadership meant directing others, Yet he had almost forgotten what it meant to serve another person with his own hands. Grace did not answer immediately. She simply offered to help carry the tray, but Victor gently shook his head and asked if she would walk beside him instead. Together they crossed the silent corridors that no longer felt forgotten. When Samuel opened the door, his warm smile widened at the unexpected sight. Victor placed the breakfast on the table with careful attention, listening as Samuel laughed softly and joked that the owner of the estate had finally learned where the kitchen was located. The light-hearted remark eased the weight that had rested upon Victor's conscience since discovering the hidden room. During breakfast, the three of them spoke not about business, investments, or household management, but about ordinary memories. Samuel recalled teaching young employees how to polish antique wood without damaging the finish, how to remember every person's birthday, and how a simple greeting each morning could change the atmosphere of an entire workplace. Grace listened quietly while pouring fresh coffee, occasionally adding small details that made Samuel laugh with genuine happiness. Victor noticed how naturally they interacted, almost like family members connected not by blood, but by years of shared kindness. After breakfast, Victor asked permission to review Samuel's medical schedule and upcoming appointments. Grace handed him a neatly organized notebook containing every prescription, doctor visit, meal preference, and daily observation recorded in careful handwriting stretching back several years. Page after page revealed remarkable consistency. There were no missed medications, no forgotten appointments, and no careless omissions. Grace had documented everything with the same dedication she brought to every task throughout the estate. Victor slowly closed the notebook, deeply aware that the greatest example of responsibility under his roof had never appeared in official reports because it had been performed quietly after everyone else believed the workday had ended. That afternoon, Victor contacted Samuel's physician and arranged additional support services, not because Grace had failed in her responsibilities, but because he realized she should never have carried such a meaningful commitment alone. He also instructed the remaining household staff that the Eastern Wing would once again become part of the daily routine rather than a forgotten corner of the estate. No dramatic announcement accompanied the decision. There was only a steady change in attitude that spread naturally through the mansion. Employees who had once whispered curious rumors now greeted Samuel with sincere respect whenever they delivered supplies or stopped by for conversation. Grace noticed the difference without saying a word. Her evening walks remained the same, but they no longer felt lonely. As the sun disappeared beyond the gardens that evening, Victor stood near the hallway where he had once hidden in silence. Looking toward the softly illuminated room at the end of the corridor, he understood that compassion became strongest when it inspired others to join it, and the quiet promise made by one faithful woman had already begun transforming an entire home. Over the next several weeks, the atmosphere inside the Hayes estate changed in ways that no expensive renovation could have accomplished. The polished floors, elegant chandeliers, and carefully landscaped gardens remained exactly the same, yet the people moving through those familiar spaces carried themselves differently. Employees who had once hurried past one another now paused to exchange friendly greetings. Kitchen staff occasionally prepared extra desserts to share with the maintenance crew. Gardeners delivered fresh flowers to Samuel's room every Monday morning without being asked. Small gestures of kindness quietly spread from one corner of the estate to another, each inspired by the example that Grace had lived for years without expecting anyone to notice. Victor observed these changes with growing gratitude, but he also recognized that lasting change required more than silent appreciation. One Friday afternoon, he invited every remaining employee to gather in the grand dining room after their work was finished. The invitation surprised everyone because meetings of that size usually concerned schedules, renovations, or financial matters. As the staff assembled beneath the crystal chandeliers, conversations filled the room with quiet curiosity. Grace took her usual place near the back, hoping to remain unnoticed as she always had. Samuel, feeling stronger after weeks of renewed companionship and professional care, accepted Victor's invitation to attend as well. Many employees had never met him before, and they respectfully welcomed the distinguished gentleman whose calm smile immediately put everyone at ease. Victor stood near the fireplace and looked around the room before speaking. Instead of discussing business performance, He began sharing a lesson he had learned inside the oldest hallway of the estate. He admitted that leadership sometimes failed when it became too focused on efficiency and forgot to notice quiet acts of humanity happening every single day. He confessed that he had believed every important responsibility appeared on official schedules. Yet the most meaningful responsibility in the entire mansion had never been written into any employee handbook. The room grew completely silent as Victor described how one faithful promise had continued long after every formal obligation had ended. Without revealing private details that Samuel preferred to keep personal, Victor explained that one member of the household had demonstrated extraordinary loyalty simply because gratitude mattered more than convenience. Many employees slowly turned toward Grace as understanding spread across their faces. Some remembered the rumors they had whispered only weeks earlier and lowered their eyes with visible embarrassment. Others smiled with admiration, realizing how completely they had misunderstood her quiet evening routine. Grace looked uncomfortable with the attention and gently shook her head as though hoping the conversation would move elsewhere. Samuel noticed her modest reaction and smiled warmly because it reflected the same humility that had inspired him from the beginning. Victor then announced a lasting change for the estate. Every employee, regardless of position, would be encouraged to share concerns, ideas, or acts of compassion without fear of being overlooked. Recognition would no longer belong only to visible achievements. Quiet faithfulness would matter just as much. The announcement received no loud applause because the moment carried too much sincerity for celebration. Instead, people exchanged thoughtful glances filled with renewed respect. Grace stood silently among them, still wearing the same simple apron she had worn for years. Nothing about her appearance had changed, yet everyone in the room now saw her differently. She had never asked for admiration, but through the steady example of one kept promise, she had quietly reminded an entire household that dignity was often revealed not by grand accomplishments, but by the gentle decisions no one expected another person to make. Several months passed, and the quiet promise that had once belonged only to Grace slowly reached its natural conclusion. Samuel regained enough strength to spend part of each afternoon walking through the estate gardens with the assistance of a cane and the cheerful encouragement of the employees who had come to know him once again. The forgotten eastern wing no longer felt hidden from the rest of the house. Fresh curtains welcomed the morning sunlight. Family photographs were displayed throughout the hallway, and laughter occasionally drifted from the sitting room, where Samuel shared stories with younger staff members eager to hear about the history of the estate. Grace continued caring for him with the same steady devotion she had shown from the beginning, but everyone noticed that her responsibilities had become lighter because kindness was now shared instead of carried by one person alone. One crisp autumn afternoon, Samuel quietly asked Grace to join him beneath a large maple tree overlooking the gardens. Golden leaves floated gently through the cool air as he thanked her for keeping a promise that many people would have considered impossible to maintain for so many years. He smiled with peaceful confidence and told her that she had already completed everything she had promised to do. The estate had become a home again, and he no longer feared being forgotten. Hearing those words brought unexpected emotion to Grace's eyes. For the first time since refusing to leave months earlier, she realized the burden she had willingly carried had finally become a memory instead of an obligation. Later that evening, Victor invited Grace to meet him in the library. Waiting on the polished oak table was the envelope containing the severance package she had declined long ago. It remained unopened exactly as she had left it, preserved because Victor believed the decision should always belong to her. He gently slid the envelope across the table and told her that she was finally free to choose whatever future she desired. Grace looked at the envelope for several quiet moments before smiling softly. She admitted that she no longer needed to stay because the promise had been fulfilled. Yet before she could thank him and quietly prepare to leave, Victor placed another document beside the envelope. It was not an employment contract for a maid. Instead, it offered her a permanent position as community steward of the Hayes estate, a newly created role dedicated to preserving the culture of compassion, mentorship, and personal care that had transformed the household. The responsibilities included welcoming new employees, helping them understand the values of the estate, organizing volunteer outreach in the local community, and ensuring that no member of the household ever felt invisible. Grace looked up in complete surprise. Victor explained that anyone could learn to clean a room or organize a schedule, but very few people could teach others how to care for human dignity through quiet example. That was a gift the estate could never afford to lose. Grace accepted the document with trembling hands, not because it promised greater status, but because it reflected genuine understanding. Her years of unseen faithfulness had finally been recognized for what they truly represented. Outside the library windows, the evening sun painted the gardens in shades of gold, while inside the mansion, a simple promise that had begun in silence ended with something even more enduring. Grace had remained because one forgotten man still needed her. Now she stayed because an entire household had learned that her greatest work had never been housekeeping. It had always been teaching others that kindness, quietly practiced each day, could become the strongest foundation any home would ever possess. 1 year later, the Hayes estate stood as a place that many people admired, not because of its impressive architecture or carefully maintained grounds, but because visitors immediately sensed something different the moment they walked through the front entrance. New employees often remarked that everyone greeted them by name on their very first day. Longtime staff quietly explained that such customs had become part of the estate itself, passed from one person to another like a treasured family tradition. At the center of that transformation was Grace, who carried her new responsibilities with the same quiet humility that had once defined her work as a maid. She never acted as though she had become more important than anyone else. She still helped clear tables when the kitchen became busy, still paused to encourage overwhelmed employees, and still visited Samuel every afternoon to share tea and conversation, even though he had regained much of his independence. Samuel often joked that Grace continued checking on him simply because old promises naturally grew into lasting friendships. Victor smiled whenever he heard those words because they reminded him how profoundly one faithful decision had reshaped his understanding of leadership. On a bright spring morning, the estate welcomed several local organizations for a community appreciation event celebrating volunteer service and neighborhood partnerships. Guests wandered through the gardens while employees guided families across the property, sharing stories about the history of the estate and its renewed commitment to serving others. During the afternoon, Victor stepped onto the small outdoor stage prepared beneath rows of flowering trees. Instead of speaking about charitable donations or business achievements, he spoke about gratitude. He explained that every meaningful change began with a single person willing to do the right thing even when nobody was watching. Then, before the gathered guests understood where his story was leading, he invited Grace to stand beside him. She hesitated with the familiar modesty that had always defined her character, but the gentle encouragement of her co-workers persuaded her forward. Victor presented her with a simple framed photograph rather than an expensive award. The picture showed the restored eastern hallway filled with warm sunlight, Samuel smiling comfortably near the window, and Grace quietly arranging fresh flowers exactly as she had done countless times before. Beneath the photograph, a small engraved plaque carried only one sentence. It read, "A promise faithfully kept can change an entire home." The audience rose to its feet in heartfelt applause. Yet Grace's attention immediately turned towards Samuel standing near the front row. He nodded proudly with grateful eyes, knowing that no public recognition could ever equal the peace she had given him during the years when he believed the world had quietly moved on without him. As the applause gradually faded, Victor looked across the faces of every employee gathered in the garden. Many of them had once mistaken quiet kindness for ordinary duty. Now they understood that the strongest character often revealed itself through the smallest unseen choices repeated day after day. The evening sunlight settled gently across the estate as conversations, laughter, and friendship filled every corner of the grounds. Grace looked around the home she had once refused to leave and realized that her promise had accomplished far more than protecting one forgotten man. It had reminded an entire household that compassion was never wasted, gratitude never expired, and true dignity could never be measured by a person's title. And on that peaceful day, everyone present remembered exactly what dignity looked like.